My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old school RPG podcast.
And in this episode, we're back on the chain gang in the prison of the Hated Pretender.
Our first segment is the basic crawl.
Prison of the Hated Pretender is a 20-page adventure written, illustrated, and laid out by Gus L. We are reviewing the revised version published by Hydra Cooperative in 2020. It was edited by Fiona Maeve Geist, Humza Kazmi, Bashir Gauss, and Anthony Wu, and the cover illustration is by Trey Causey. The module involves the exploration of a tower, which is a prison for an ancient god king, the Hated Pretender of the title. The Hated Pretender was placed there by a mysterious bird-worshipping cult, presumably for the atrocities he committed during his reign. Now immortal via magic and completely mad, he is forever tormented by the bird-like phantasms who are his jailers.
The module starts with some preliminary information about how it should be used. It's worth noting here that the module is presented as a teaching dungeon, similar in style to Tomb of the Serpent Kings. There is boxed off text throughout that discusses common dungeon elements such as rumors and hooks, factions, dungeon entrances, puzzles and traps, etc. The actual adventure part of the module begins with a short description of the village of Broken Huts, which is the staging area before reaching the tower. This section has information on a few colorful NPCs as well as a table of hooks and rumors. From there we get some information on the factions within the prison, which is basically just the Hated Pretender, and the bones of the Pretender's victims in life, which are buried in the tower and magicked so that their spirits create a constant stream of bird-like phantasms to torment the Pretender. Next are stats and descriptive text for the Pretender and the phantasms. Then we get a map of the tower itself. Each of the 4 levels of the tower is described in some detail. Some highlights include a gnarled tree on the outside that can be used to reach the higher floors, a circle of wards that keeps both the Pretender and the phantasms trapped in the tower, a museum of horror detailing the Pretender's crimes, the Pretender's filthy abode, a rooftop grotto, a pumpkin patch, a magical Armillary Sphere, and the crypts where most of the treasure in this adventure can be found. The module concludes with a blank map of the tower and notes on 5e conversions. Let's talk about how we have used this module in our gaming. Tom?
I have only read it in preparation for this podcast. How about you, Jason?
I have run it thrice with 3 different groups. The first time we actually ended prematurely, but the second and third group we managed to finish it.
Yeah, interesting.
Things we liked about the module. Tom, from a read, what do you care for so far?
The thing that's most notable about it is the day-night cycle that is going on. I assume that's a key feature when you play through it, although, as we'll get to later, I think the plot-free, location-based adventure, although it's kind of my favourite genre, sometimes it's really hard to tell what's going to happen. But yeah, I think the day-night thing, which is to do with the phantasms, right? So they come out during the day and they work in daylight, but they are afraid of, or they're less powerful in darkness. I think that's right. So basically the Pretender can roam around in dark places and the phantasms can roam around in the light. And I think that's really interesting. I think it's a great central hook where months later, when you're talking about the dungeon and everyone forgot the title, they'll say, the night and day one. So that's what I like about it.
Right. The sort of day-night differences in the dungeon, it's a major feature of the dungeon, and having run it a few times, I can tell you that it has a very profound impact on how the dungeon plays out. It's kind of a twist thing, because normally you would consider a dungeon to most likely be safest during the daytime, but that's not the case in Prison of the Hated Pretender. In Prison of the Hated Pretender, the daytime is more dangerous because the phantasms like the daylight and they dislike the dark. And so clever playgroups, and one of my playgroups was clever in this way, they wanted to go in the day. They were like, no, we're going to go in the day because they're thinking it's safer during the day. Turns out it's not safer during the day. Most parts of the dungeon are much more dangerous because the phantasms are freely floating about. We should mention the phantasms are like these sort of ghostly bird creatures that can take different forms.
Avenging spirit kind of things, right?
And they do like heat blast magic and stuff and things like that. But interestingly, another way that the dungeon sort of plays with this idea of day and night is what would normally be the most dangerous part of the dungeon, the subterranean portion. That actually it's kind of reversed because in the day, that part of the dungeon is actually very safe because you can go down there. It's dark. The phantasms are roaming around, but the rest of the dungeon is not safe. The sort of ideally dangerous part is less dangerous. And it's reversed at night because that's when the phantasms are below, sheltering in the catacombs at night, because the catacombs, or the not catacombs, but like the little crypt at the bottom, it's lit with these glowing gemstones that sort of light the space. They like the light. The dungeon is really cool in that way. It sort of twists around your expectations, and it feels really different. And I've had groups, the 2 groups that finished it, they went in at different times, and it was a totally different play experience.
I also like how it's still a decision that you're making. Like, once you figured out the day-night thing, you can still go in the daytime. The phantasms don't move that quickly, so like if you are fighting them or whatever, that's kind of your fault. And also, because I think the only sort of media reference I can think of for the day being, unless you're a vampire, for the day being dangerous is this, I don't know if you caught it, a Belgian Netflix drama called Into the Night about like daylight is just killing everyone on Earth. So it's about these people on an airliner who have to keep flying into the darkness and refueling and then leaving as fast as they can. That's the thing, like in that case, the daylight just kills you. There's no decision. It's just like a deadline. Whereas here, you can still do that kind of cost-benefit analysis about where you're going to go and when, right? So that's really cool.
Well, that actually leads to something I really like about the dungeon, in addition to the sort of the way day and night work, which is this sort of physicality of the dungeon. I was actually chatting with Gus around the time I was getting ready to run Prison of the Hated Pretender. And Gus sort of explained to me that one of his major goals for the dungeon was that it's about exploring the space, it's about moving through the space, and it's about the sort of puzzle that is the environment. And the dungeon is great in that way. Like, the way it's constructed, the players can like legitimately suss things out based off like how things are arranged. And it's really fun to watch them do it. So a great example, on the entry level of the dungeon, the ground floor, the center of the room on the floor, it's basically like a circular chamber that is bisected, right? There are like little rooms all along the perimeter, and then there's the sort of front room you walk into. And in the middle of all that on the floor is this circle of jade wards that keep the phantasms and the pretender trapped inside. But the thing is when the characters go in, you describe the jade wards, and as they look at them, and especially if you show them the map, they can see that the jade wards sit equally in all of the little rooms that make up the lower floor. Like, it kind of stretches into all of them. And they eventually begin to realize that the phantasms, they can't cross the ward, like to go into the part of the ground floor that leads to the exit. And so as you're sort of revealing things to them, the players like figure that out. Like, you can see them like kind of doing the puzzle in their heads, and it works really, really well. Another aspect of the physicality is the tree on the outside. So the safest way to reach the upper levels is to climb that tree, because otherwise you have to go up the stairs, which is, depending on what time of day you enter, could be crawling with phantasms, right? There's other ways it does it too, but the whole dungeon is this like interesting physical space puzzle, which I found to be really, really intriguing.
Yeah, that's good. I like the tree as well, because that tree is sort of leans over towards an upper window you can get in, right? But that's been complicated because on your way in, you may also well have heard the rumour that it's a magic hanging tree that strangles anybody who climbs it.
I will tell you that Prison of the Hated Pretender, when you read through it, and this is not a knock on it necessarily, but when you read through it, it doesn't really seem like much.
No, this is the thing. And you see, I'm on record as saying I think lots of adventures have emergent content that you can't really see on a read-through. And that's why I'm very keen to hear about, your experiences of it, because, yeah, I had that. And I felt like it seems like there might be something here, but I just couldn't. It's one of those occasions I couldn't picture in my head things that might happen, which is a failing on my part, for sure, but still.
Yeah, I had a similar experience. I mean, I only chose to run this because it came highly recommended by some folks I was talking to. I downloaded the original version, and then I figured out there was a new one, so I got the new one. And I read through it, and I kind of had like a, is this it? kind of moment,
Yeah.
Like, this doesn't seem like much, but honestly, when you start playing it, it's intricacies, the way it all interlocks together, the basic puzzle of it really comes alive in play in a really, really strong way. Even in a game like Trophy Gold, where you can kind of like use hunt roll tokens to hand wave away some of the stuff, it still came out really strongly. A very pleasant surprise.
Yeah, that's great.
What are some other things you liked about it, Tom?
I do quite like the voice and the presentation of it. It's, without wanting to be mean, I don't think it looks quite as slick as other Hydra cooperative products. I think, because this is all the work of one guy, it's got a certain personal, this is an auteurish creation to it. And like, for example, the boxed text, which is not read aloud descriptions, but rather more of which later, which is like the instructional part. Now, this has been and is currently being, because I'm about to say this, compared to Tomb of the Serpent King as a teaching dungeon. But I would say this is a lot less direct than Serpent. Like, Serpent King is going through and, like, you get to the first trap and it says, this trap is like this because A, B, and C. If you want to do a trap like this, then you should do steps 1, 2, 3. If you're looking for that kind of instruction from Hated Pretender, you will be slightly disappointed. There are some bits of here's what to do, but mostly it feels a bit like a director's commentary on DVDs. Remember them, kids? You know, like it's sort of, I tend to like it when such and such a thing is like this, or here's a thing I do with morale rolls. You know, it's all a bit, it feels a bit like Gus is sitting next to you, kind of looking over your shoulder and rudely pointing things out when you're trying to read. Go away, Gus, stop it. But I liked all that, and it's his own artwork as well, which has this it sort of has these greenish tinges to it, which is a deliberate colour palette thing, but it feels like, not exactly like a woodcut, but it has that slightly flat, medievalish feel to it, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's good.
And yet there's a lot of energy in the lines too. I know what you're saying about the art, but it also has it definitely also has like a kind of energy to it. The line strokes and stuff, like it makes it feel a little, I don't know, it felt very like alive and active to me as I was looking at it. It was a nice effect. Yeah, I like that.
Oh yeah, sorry, when I say flat, I mean it feels like a compressed perspective kind of thing. Yeah, not flat as in like...
got it. Okay, I see what you're saying. Yeah,
sorry.
Okay, that's good. No worries. Something else I really enjoyed about the dungeon is kind of going on some of the aesthetic choices. I love that there's a blank map. That is such
bravo.
It's a small thing, but my gosh, publishers of dungeons, put blank maps in your PDFs, or make it so that you can like manipulate the layers and take away things that the players don't need to know. Importantly, like big S's where secret doors are, right? Like, it's so helpful. Just please.
Yeah. And because, hey, we know for a fact, okay, that you put those numbers or letters on in layers in Photoshop, so you can take them away. It's not that hard. But actually, I think it is, even if you could do the layer manipulation in a PDF, I think a blank map page is better, because it's so much simpler to just print that page than to kind of sit there fiddling around with controls.
Yeah, absolutely. Some more like substantive things that I enjoyed about the dungeon, kind of piggybacking on what I said earlier about the dungeon being kind of like a physical puzzle. The treasures in the dungeon are kind of their own puzzle also, which was another fascinating aspect that doesn't really come out until you start playing it. Depending on A, what time of day the party goes into the tower, and B, what order they go in, whether they go into the bottom floor or they climb the tree and go top down, they get a different perspective on what is valuable in this tower. This is particularly important when I was running in Trophy Gold, because Trophy Gold's main animating force for the characters is finding treasure. So if they go topside, especially if they go topside at night where the Pretender is roaming around because the phantasms aren't there, they will discover this pumpkin that the Pretender is very, very dedicated to.
Yep.
He loves this pumpkin. He's very, very like protective of it. And you can chat with the Pretender and learn all that stuff. You can learn about his enthusiasm for this pumpkin. That pumpkin stands in sharp contrast to this very impressive, large, magical construct that's also on the roof, which the Pretender doesn't seem to care about at all. And so the players get this like idea of, okay, the Pretender's clearly mad. And so later on, when they are presented with the opportunity to find the Pretender's treasure in his abode, they are automatically keyed into thinking, this is probably not something we want, because the Pretender is clearly insane. And that's how one of my groups sort of did it. This was especially fun in Trophy Gold because I made one of the set goals, find the Pretender's hidden treasure. The players could do that naturally by just finding it, or they could spend 3 hunt roll tokens. But the sort of twist is, if they spend the 3 hunt roll tokens, the treasure they're getting is basically worthless because it's just like little bits of crap that the Pretender's obsessed with. And so they've just kind of wasted 3 hunt roll tokens, right? They could have spent those on actual treasures. That came out so nicely in play. Just this whole idea of what is valuable in the tower based off when the characters approach, who they talk to, what time of day. It just comes out in such a cool way, and it's just another part of the puzzle.
Yeah, actually, let's talk about the Pretender. I think he's an interesting character. He seems like he'd be fun to play. He also is like the man in the Iron Mask but turned up to 11, right?
Right,
How did you portray him? Is he actually fun for players to interact with, or is he a bit, I don't know.
So only one of my groups really got to interact with the Pretender a lot because they went at nighttime, because in the day he's hiding in his shadowy abode where the phantasms can't get to him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that group loved it. I mean, they had a really good time interacting with the Pretender. I had a great time role-playing the Pretender, I'm not going to lie. I definitely went with... I have a few, stock characterizations that are always winners, And one of those is skulking about in the dark ghoul man who's clearly crazy. That sort of characterization is fun to roleplay, and you're supported in the module because the module does tell you quite a bit about the Pretender's behavior, his activities, his habits, his enthusiasms, and so all of that, you sort of take what the module gives you. You kind of bring a really nice characterization to it, and yeah, it's a big highlight of the module for sure when you play it that way. And that is one of the things I really loved about the dungeon as well, was just getting a chance to play the Pretender. It's a great character. Any other little things that you liked before we move on?
Let's see what else. There's a little village called Broken Huts mentioned in the introduction. It's quite nicely drawn, I thought. Just different and horrible enough to be memorable on your way through. Mm-hmm. Good rumours, or true rumours as well, or true enough, which is nice. I'm not a big fan of the red herring. So that was good. How about you? Anything else that's on your like list?
Oh, the Armillary Sphere. Great fun.
Oh, yeah.
The Armillary Sphere is a terrific part of the dungeon. Yeah. Basically, the way it works, listeners, is there's this big Armillary Sphere, which is on the rooftop of the dungeon, and it can only be used once, and you can set it to, if you just mess with it, just change the settings on it to some night sky of some sort, it has these various magical effects that can happen to the characters. But there's also it's another part of the sort of puzzle of the dungeon, because down below in the crypt, the little gems that light the abode of the phantasms actually are a constellation. They're like a night sky. And so you can put that pattern into the Armillary Sphere, and it totally shuts down the phantasms. None of my groups figure that out.
No, that one seems a little tricky to get, I would say.
It's a little tricky, yeah. But I like it in theory, though. Yeah. And I actually totally stole this idea for a Trophy Gold incursion that I just published called Temple of the Peerless Star. I kind of stole this idea of star charts that can be entered in my incursion as spherical astrolabe. But so yeah, that was really fun.
Yeah,
it was a fun part of the dungeon.
It occurs to me actually, astrolabes, orreries, and armillary spheres. That's another OSR trope, isn't it? I think if this had been made by snake people or cockroaches, yeah.
Yeah, bug people, stink people, and orreries / armillaries and stuff. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. This is not something that I really liked necessarily. I mean, I did like it, but it's not something I'm calling out because I liked it, but rather I just want to highlight it for listeners, especially listeners who might be thinking about running this. Don't forget about a character called Black Jenny. Black Jenny is not detailed in the module, but she's mentioned several times in the module. She's basically like a bandit queen. The villagers talk about her. The Pretender's kind of obsessed with her because she came and raided the tower. You can see lots of evidence of Black Jenny and her bandits having been there before you. The module doesn't say what happened to Black Jenny or where Black Jenny is, but if you just need a twist in the fiction, or you need to kind of bring something back, or you just need some kind of extra danger, Black Jenny and her gang is a great way to go.
Good call.
Questions we had about the module. Tom?
What did you think about the layout in play? I thought it was mostly good. It's got all the useful things highlighted, but my one slight complaint is I noticed that the descriptions of locations and what's there in the day and what's there in the night Could that have been signposted with little sun and moon icons? That's what I would have done.
It definitely could have. I found that to be an annoying part of the module. It was only bearable because the module is fairly short. But yes, some sort of like symbolic representation of this is a daytime thing, this is a nighttime thing would have gone a long way.
Yeah.
My questions. Gus takes a pretty strong stance against boxed text or read aloud text in dungeons. How do you feel about that?
I'm broadly on board with it, except for that box text, which from an old TSR module that just says, I think, skeletons, hundreds of them running at you. But no, because I know you're a bit of a fan. I am a fan, sort of taken that on board. I think like a couple of lines can be okay, but I do generally prefer that kind of bullet pointed or bolded elements in the text, so that you kind of, when you're there, you just kind of skim through the points and you join them together as you say them, rather than trying to paraphrase what's there. Although I will say, I think Gus's strong anti-box text stance is slightly undermined by the fact that there are a few bits of description that I think are a little bit box texty in the module. But it's not. But the thing is, it is there for the GM to kind of take in and enjoy, and it's just a couple of times. So, yeah, broadly, I do think it's correct. Or if you're going to do box text, I'll tell you what I've been doing lately. As you know, I translate materials from a Portuguese language role-playing game called The Elephant and Macaw Banner, available now in all good game shops, folks. The writers there do quite often use fairly extensive box text, especially because it's designed for people who haven't really done role-playing games before, and they see it as like here's a bit of a sort of thing to lean on when you're doing the next scene. And there have been times where in the translation, I've allowed myself the editorialization of just kind of, the instruction instead of read this aloud is read or paraphrase. And then I'll often also do like underlining the key bits and say, read the underlined bits if you don't read the whole thing. I think that's a decent halfway compromise, you know?
It's a pretty good compromise, yeah. It's funny. I was listening to some really old episodes of this show. At one point, my stance was no box text.
Yeah, that's really? Where was that? I don't remember that. Yeah.
It was, yeah. There was a point where I was like, fuck box text. And then later, at some point, I am pro boxed text, and I'm still pro box text. I like it. So Gus's argument is that it sort of takes away from the sort of creativity of the GM and their own like sort of personal understanding of the space, and maybe like inhibits them. I don't subscribe to that view. I think you can do both. I think you can read the little entry bit when they come into the space and then sort of riff and improvise as they begin exploring the space. So, I don't know. I think you're both wrong, but...
Okay. I mean, I guess it's true what they say. You do get more pro box text as you get older, don't you? So
it's true, yeah. I'm a living example of that old canard. Other question I had... I could not, for the life of me, figure out why the Beaked God cult, which imprisoned the Pretender, why they imprisoned him with his Armillary Sphere. What was the point of that? Did you pick up on that at all?
I couldn't work it out either. It seems very dangerous because it's a massively powerful magical item. The only thing I think maybe it doesn't matter because we can sit here and come up with theories all day long, right? So, like, the thing that springs to mind for me is maybe they didn't know what it was. So they were like, we can't move it. True. Let's just leave it. And luckily for them, it didn't work for him anymore.
I think they did know what it was because the reason why it stuck out in my mind is, okay, so listeners, you learn in the Museum of Horrors, there's like these reliefs or paintings or something that like explain what the crimes of the Pretender were. And one of the images shows the Pretender using the Armillary Sphere as like a weapon against his own people. So they had to have some notion that it was a weapon of some sort. In any case, why'd they bring it along and imprison him there?
Oh, well, maybe the wards kept its magic inside as well? That's,
Yeah, I don't know. I thought it was a strange choice. I didn't dwell on it too much. It never really came up in my game because my players never made that connection, but like they just thought it was just something that existed before it was a prison or whatever. But anyway, I just thought it was an interesting, maybe intentional omission. Let's go to the chain lightning round. My favorite line in the module, in which Broken Huts is described as a, quote, hamlet of scabrous yokels.
We have mentioned it a little bit earlier, but yeah, I really like how the Armillary Sphere can only be used once. Quote, its ancient workings finally giving up with a final wrench of possibility. And then, it takes like 10 years to fix it, if ever. And it's a tremendously powerful magical item that's going to send your heroes off on adventures, but only once. That's really good.
A bit of Gus's dungeon philosophy that I do agree with is describe the monsters as you think the characters would see them rather than by name.
From within the tower, some frescoes are described as flaking and all defaced, the eyes of stern judges hacked away, and the phrase, "I not kneel or bow," written in tall, dark brown letters across them.
Of the aforementioned pumpkin, growing in a cracked stoneware bathtub, slip glaze painted with birds pecking a crowned skull, is a fat orange pumpkin. Immediately obvious and surrounding the tub, a circle of glyphs has been painted in brown paste. This pumpkin is mundane, but considered a pet and future meal by the Pretender.
On a similar topic, the Pretender prizes cooked meals and would do almost anything for a piece of pie.
Let's go to the next segment. It's the Expert Delve.
Okay, what are we talking about today, Jason?
Our topic for today is daylight dungeoneering. Or daylight dungeon crawls, maybe we'll say. I like dungeoneering, though. The premise, inspired by the fact that Prison of the Hated Pretender is a really different dungeon during the day, I wanted to talk about this idea of doing a daylight dungeon crawl. And here I mean exploring something above ground during the day, although some of these ideas might be relevant in a subterranean dungeon if those dungeons are very well lit. I should also mention that I am using the sort of dungeon world definition of a dungeon, which is any space where adventurers are crawling around, right? It doesn't have to be a literal
like a sort of room-by-room environment, right? So just not a city.
Precisely,
but, okay, yeah.
A place to adventure and explore. An above-ground dungeon, ruined castles, or maybe some kind of natural structure that's exposed to sunlight in the day. I think there's a few things I want to talk about. First of all, I do think that a daytime dungeon crawl should have a very different feel than if it's being done at night. The second thing I want to talk about is whether and how you keep the feeling of tension and danger high in such an environment. And finally, I want to go slightly sideways and talk about the idea of full daylight horror.
Okay.
How does all that sound?
Sounds promising, and in some ways, difficult. So I guess we'll talk our way through it. Although one thing that does occur to me as well, I think a lot of existing dungeon crawls are accidentally daylight anyway, because people, your classic 5e-ish D&D sort of forgets about torches and what's visible and what's not, and it's all just a series of quite blandly lit interior sets. But okay, bad-mouthing 5e, check, let's move on. But check. Yeah, maybe what's important as well is that contrast between light and shadow.
Right. I think a lot of dungeon crawls are written with a sort of assumption that it's going to be taking place in the dark.
Yeah.
I don't think that's like explicit necessarily. Even dungeons that are like crumbling temples, or crumbling castles or whatever, where there's clearly sun overhead or the possibility of sun overhead, they just read as if it's meant to be dark, right? Like it's meant to be nighttime.
Yeah.
But the thing is, it's almost entirely unhelpful in the sense that players will always try to search things with the aid of daylight if they can. So even though I feel like dungeon authors want things to be happening in the darkness, players will always try to find a way to make sure it's not happening in the darkness. Mm-hmm. But the bad thing is, it's not bad, but like the sort of less optimal thing, or the not galaxy brain thing, is if you just present the dungeon as it's written with no consideration of daytime or nighttime. And I think that's kind of what I'm getting at here. And so for the first little topic, this idea of how do you make a daytime dungeon crawl feel differently from a nighttime dungeon crawl, it's a pretty straightforward topic, honestly, but I just think it's worth highlighting.
Yeah.
My initial thoughts. I think it really comes down to how do you convey things to the players. We have talked about in other episodes, like when we talked about frozen waste environments or swamp environments, we've talked about like how you describe things, how you present things, how you narrate the environment as the GM. And this is a similar kind of idea. The day sounds different than the night. There are different animals doing their thing. If the ruins that you're searching are near a village or a heavily traveled road, you'll be able to hear those places. The daytime feels different than the nighttime. It's probably warmer, so you should focus on, or at least acknowledge that, like that sort of hazy warmth if it's that kind of like full bright sunlight day. Most importantly, everything should look differently in the day. If there's good light, you should take a moment to emphasize the brightness of the colors. You should focus on textures. You should be very generous in what you tell the players they can see. Those are my opening thoughts about like just how you make these things, how you make it feel a little differently. It's just a basic acknowledgement. It doesn't have to be like a obsess over it, right? It just needs to be acknowledged, I think, when you're presenting the dungeon.
Yeah, just enough for the players to be able to picture the difference in it. Yeah, it hadn't occurred to me exactly, but I suppose, things happening at longer range as well. Like, you're looking around.
Yeah, exactly.
When you're just kind of scouting the area for secret doors, you'll be looking way further away across.
Absolutely.
I mean, what I'm picturing here is things like, how they've taken the floor off the Colosseum in Rome and you can see all the tunnels below, but you can see them from above. That's the kind of thing I'm picturing, I guess.
That's absolutely right. The classic dungeon setup is I have a torch and I can only see whatever's in the perimeter of my torchlight. And beyond the perimeter of my torchlight, I can see very little or just shapes, silhouettes, or maybe nothing. And it's just not that way in the day, right? Like in the day, you can just full on see everything. And that kind of goes back to what I was saying a little bit earlier. You should be generous in what you present to the group. If they're in a large chamber that, the ceiling's removed because it's crumbled away, and it's daytime, they can see everything. They can see literally everything. Like there's nothing hiding in the shadows. They can see the exact number of doors. They can see what the doors look like. Imagine like the Mines of Moria. If that was like exposed to sunlight, it would have a totally different effect. Right? Like it would be a totally different environment in the movie. Moving on.
Yeah.
I think there's a question of tension and danger that has to be addressed when we're talking about a daytime dungeon crawl. First of all, you should probably consider whether this even matters. It could very well be that the dungeon is definitely lower tension and definitely less dangerous because it's happening in the day. And that's kind of what makes Prison of the Hated Pretenders twist so good, is because your expectation is that the daytime is safer. And there's lots of reasons for that. Dangerous nocturnal creatures are probably asleep. The party is probably well rested. Like we said earlier, you can just see everything much better. So it's an open question of whether you should even be concerned about the tension and danger. Maybe the space is meant to feel safer and be safer, and the players should be congratulated on their cleverness of choosing to go at day instead of night. But I don't know. Yeah. I still think there should be some tension, but I think it's worth kind of saying maybe there's not.
Yeah, no, exactly. Well, hang on. So sometimes it can be safer, and I think that's good, especially if you're using it as a prelude to the danger of the dark, which I think is one of your later points. But, for example, you can also use it to emphasize how this actual outdoor place, for example, changes with the nighttime. If you're deliberately not going at night because that's too dangerous, and let's say you visit this ancient cathedral twice, then suddenly you've got to go, but it's dark. Immediately that's going to ramp up the tension because we deliberately didn't go there when it was dark before. Why are we going when it's dark now? Well, we have to go now. We have to go within the next 3 hours, that kind of thing. The fact that you were specifically choosing never to do it the other way is a good way to telegraph how bad it's going to get later on. I think that's one use of it. But there are ways to make things tense and dangerous in the daylight.
I mean, I think you can make a fair case, and this is probably more for like people writing a dungeon than like presenting it as a GM, but I think you can make a fair case that it is actually less dangerous for the reasons I mentioned. But that doesn't mean that you can't still have tension. It doesn't mean you still can't have like suspense and like a sort of foreboding feeling as the characters are doing their thing. I like what you said earlier about like maybe the daytime portion is a prelude to a dark portion. This is especially the case where the dungeon has multiple levels and the top part is just the sort of entryway to the real proper dungeon down below. You can do things to help set that up, to telegraph the danger. I love sounds or other evidence of the monsters that might be creeping around in the dark. Signs of occult activity is great. Harbinger NPCs, fabulous way of keeping the tension high in an otherwise well-lit, illuminated space. Those are things to consider. The daylight presents an excellent opportunity to tell the story of whatever people used to live or inhabit the space that they're exploring. And that story might be a grim one. Now, this obviously depends a great deal on what the dungeon is actually about, but consider the Maze of Nuruman, which we're going to talk about in a future episode.
Oh, yeah.
The Maze of Neuroman has a topside daylight part, right? It really emphasizes the depraved activities that these people were getting up to. They were into necromantic shit. In full daylight, you get a full, like, oh, this is what they were doing, right? Like, there's no secret. Nothing is hidden. You get to see all their horrible statues. You get to see all their terrible artwork. You get to see evidence of their crazy occult doings. And that can create a sort of tension, like, because you're sort of telling the story of the place. And that's a certain type of tension, even if it's not especially dangerous. So those are just some thoughts about, like, keeping the tension high. I do think that this is very effective and easy to do when the daytime portion is a prelude to something else.
Yeah, although it occurs to me there are other kinds of tension apart from danger. So you could, if you consider the reason you might deliberately travel by night, one thing is when it's daylight, other people can see you. So if you think about the whole rival party of adventurers who are also looking for the treasure, suddenly that daylight becomes a problem. I'm not suggesting like the rival team of evil adventurers who are going to kill you. I mean, literally just like I think I'm going to get to the treasure before you do guy.
Right, yeah.
That's still exciting. It's just not a physical threat as much as it is like a race or a kind of trying to avoid each other, that kind of thing. It could be good. Also, you've just reminded me of a very striking old Call of Cthulhu scenario. The God of the Mountain, I think. It's in the same collection as Dream Factory, actually. And it's about finding what's up with this archaeological dig in a Mesoamerican abandoned city, which is just on the top of a mountain plateau, completely exposed. So the whole thing is just this. The scary thing about the environment is that it's all in broad daylight and you're the only people there, and the only thing watching you is this giant mountain, and it's all exposed pretty much. Like there's a couple of little buildings that you can go into, but they're just, they're ancient one-room cottages. It's just everything is out in the open, and that's the scary part. There's nowhere to hide. So
yeah,
being seen from far away, that's the threat, isn't it? I guess. Yeah.
I've been suggesting that daytime dungeons are sort of inherently less dangerous than nighttime presentations, but that's not always true. There are specific daytime sorts of dangers. Nocturnal monstrosities might be asleep, but big, dangerous, real-world animals probably aren't, like bears. I mean, I wouldn't take my chance with a grizzly bear. That's as dangerous as half the monsters in the monster manual.
Isn't that the dictum, always use a bear for the stats?
Right, yeah, I know, yeah. And like you said, other people, like bandits and things like that, you can have things crawl up from a dark place, like a well in the village. That's always a really great trick. I think especially if you are writing an above-ground dungeon or if you're getting ready to run one and you want to kind of be really considerate of the daytime things, you need to keep that stuff in mind, right? Like, are there different types of monsters or dangers during the day? What's the ecology like during the day as opposed to the night? And if it's different, you should express that. So the last thing I want to talk about in this segment is kind of an adjacent conversation, but relevant, which is this idea of full daylight horror, okay? I think that dungeon crawls are, or at least should be, a certain type of horror fiction. I think we have to consider the possibility of full daylight horror. Like, what is it? Why do we do it? How do we achieve it? I should mention that this is a very, very in vogue concept right now in the world of horror cinema, this idea of scary things in full daylight, but it's always been around. Full daylight horror, of course, is just what it sounds like. Scary things are happening in the full light of the sun. I always go to movies here, but think about, this could be pagan cults doing their pagan cult shit, like in Wicker Man or Midsommar, or rural horror, like Children of the Corn or The Hills Have Eyes. Cinema is a really good touchstone here, because if GMs really want to take their horror game to the next level, or dungeon writers want to explore this type of horror, they should sit down and watch some of these films. And in particular, they should focus on, how do they make you feel? Is the bright daylight comforting or foreboding? When the horror elements pierce the light, does it feel heightened? Does it feel jarring? Does it feel camp, maybe? Does it feel like something else? I think full daylight horror is a distinctly different experience from dark horror, and worth exploring and worth taking a look at.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I hadn't really thought of daylight horror as a genre, but yeah, you can draw a line through a lot of... what else? Invasion of the Body Snatchers, that kind of thing? That's sort of a bit of a daylighty thing. Yeah,
it's a different type, but yeah, it definitely is, right? I think the reason why daylight horror can be so powerful is because of the way it intersects with common themes in life. This is why rural settings are so popular for the daylight horror genre, because of the themes that are in play. Rural means agriculture, which means sunlight, and that interplay between agriculture, which is life, and horror, which is death, is very irresistible. It's what makes a scarecrow kind of unnerving. A scarecrow serves a life-giving purpose by keeping birds off crops, but there's simultaneously these sort of limp, garish facsimiles of life. It's freaky. Tall rows of corn, about as literal a symbol of life as you can get. In the horror context, they become oppressive. It's life and fecundity that's sort of isolating you and hiding the thing that's trying to kill you. Your example of Invasion of the Body Snatchers is terrific, because what makes that movie so scary, and here I mean the one with Donald Sutherland, what makes that movie so scary is you have this sense of safety. There's a presumption of safety when you're talking to people you know, especially in the day, and suddenly they're not safe.
Exactly.
That's the scary bit. When that mirage of safety is shattered, that's what makes it scary. When the daylight is pierced, that's what makes it scary. That sudden intrusion of violence into a bucolic setting.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And it's made me think as well, this idea of threats that are existing in, maybe you can see them coming, you're in normal life, but you can't do anything about it. So if the most literally daylight film of all, High Noon, if you want to think about that, where despite all these townsfolk being around, wait, it's Gary Cooper, right? Yeah. He can't stop that train arriving. And I'm now thinking, look, what's the dungeon equivalent of that? And I guess it would be some horrible threat that in a subterranean dungeon you would think is somewhere in the dark, but you don't know where it is. And that's the scary thing. Above ground, the scary thing is you can see it coming towards you and there's not a lot you can do about it. And it's getting closer and closer. Something like that. Yeah.
I don't know what my dungeon-specific advice is here, except to say that you should just consume this media. You should consume good examples of dungeons that do this. I can think of several that are sort of horror-based dungeons that take place in the day. Some examples of kind of what I'm talking about. The opening part of Deep Carbon Observatory is this, because it's in the day. You can hear lots of people. You can see lots of people, but they're clearly in distress. It's that distress. It's that seeing them in a sort of almost like an apocalyptic situation in an otherwise like pleasant setting is what makes it that way. I published a dungeon for Trophy Gold called Hester's Mill, the very first original one, in fact. And it is all of these concepts in one dungeon. Gets everything I'm talking about in this one dungeon. I think it's a great example. There's a few others, but and we've talked about some of them in past episodes. For the overall topic, just consider what it means for your dungeon to possibly be happening in the day and how that changes things. Let's go to the next segment. It's companion adventures. Tom, what you got?
Okay, I mean, I'll level with you. I struggled with this because, every kind of dungeony, adventure-y or whatever story I could think of, man, they're all in the dark. But then I tried to think more laterally, and what I got about dungeon delving but in sunlight made me think about archaeological digs and Egyptology and so on. Aside from the perennial thing like, the Egyptology episode of every TV show like Poirot or Quantum Leap, I also think bits in Indiana Jones movies are relevant here. So End of Last Crusade, that's a whole daylit dungeon, right? And in fact, the Templar guy, he's a bit like the Hated Pretender, but nice.
Yeah.
But also Raiders of the Lost Ark, and that's the thing I mentioned, sort of where you're trying to do some treasure hunting and not be seen by other people. That I think is really interesting. This idea of rocking around looking for treasure that way. Other daylight dungeons, I think, are Dawn of the Dead, right?
Oh, yeah, that's
Shopping
a good
mall,
one.
basically daylit. So there, what you've got is it's the mobility thing, which actually is in Hated Pretender as well, isn't it? The Pretender and the Phantasms can't catch you if you run, but if you mess up and don't run, then they'll get you. Also, Full Metal Jacket, the bit at the end in the city, I think that's another way that danger happens in daylight, is that you get spotted from a long way away and shot at or fireballed by someone, whatever. And there's that. And then there's one, if you don't mind me stealing, that you put in the notes, Jason, but did not mention out loud yet, which is Jaws. I think this is such a good call. And actually that connects to Deep Carbon Observatory in a way, which also has that witch skimming around under the water in a kind of Jawsy way, that sort of thing where you can see what you're doing, but there's something about that daylight or darkness doesn't matter to the monster, basically. So that's really cool. Yeah. How about you? Have you got game things or something else?
I've got films mostly.
Okay.
My films are about the idea of full daylight horror. I mentioned quite a few in my in my discursion earlier, but but also I want to throw out watch Midsommar, right? I mean, from 2019, it's just a great movie in general, but it's such a good example of the sort of modern full daylight horror movie. So go watch that. But some older things, I think the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a fabulous film for the idea of full daylight horror, because in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and here I mean the original one from 1974, in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, one of my all-time favorite movies and my absolute favorite horror movie, the daytime portions, in my opinion, are more scary than the nighttime portions. There is a nighttime back third of the movie, but by the time we get to that point, it's just sort of madness and hysteria and running around, right? It's not as scary. The scary parts are in the beginning, the sort of sun-baked Texas earth, the sound of like bone wind chimes, the quite sudden intrusions of Leatherface into the scene, just the sort of like strange weirdness of the hitchhiker character, that whole sequence. So it's a good example of like, hey, the day can be scary. In fact, it is much scarier.
Yeah, man, you've just reminded me of that Australian film, Wolf Creek. Did you ever see that? Sort of based on
yeah. I mean, the nighttime of Texas Chainsaw Massacre is almost camp, right? Like it's really close to being camp. Like it's almost there. So yeah, it's a great example of a good daylight horror movie. I also want to throw out 28 Days Later, classic British zombie film from 2003. I love this as a daytime horror example because the whole first, definitely the whole first sequence and a good part of the early part of the movie is just the main character roaming around this post-apocalyptic landscape, and he can see so far out. You can see, we see through his eyes like just the full extent of what happened in this place going hundreds of yards in the distance, right? We can see everything. And there's something about that idea of, look at all of this devastation. You can't hide from it. It's everywhere. It's all around you. And you only get that effect in the daytime.
That is true. What else have I got? Oh, amphitheaters. I started thinking about like outdoor locations where you could sort of have cool action sequences and like see far away I want to go somewhere, but then have to figure out how to get there. Yeah, there's a bit in Ronin from 1998 and Way of the Dragon with Bruce Lee. He fought well. That's not exactly in an amphitheater. That's in front of some paintings of the Colosseum. But the point is, it's a multi-level, but very open ruined structure. So I think that's a good model. I'm not saying just go watch those films purely for for the very short scenes they have in amphitheaters, but nevertheless. And then finally, I eventually did think of some games that are set in ruined cities, which I think is a great overground dungeon, right? So there's Big Rubble for RuneQuest. I don't know how available that is. It's quite old. And it's basically, it's like a walled city that's fallen into ruin and it's just an adventure location. And then Luka Rajic recently-ish was working and publishing material called Red Sky Dead City, which is like about where an invading army has taken over some land and then there's a nearby city that is being looted by... It's an ancient ruined city that they're kind of looting, and then other people who already lived there are sort of in conflict with them. I'm not too sure how available that is either, but it's worth a Google, Red Sky Dead City. Again, for this idea of, so it's like an urban environment, but mostly empty, and you're watching out. Again, this idea of like long ranges of being able to see what's going on and see things coming for you, or have to hide from them and stuff, So, this material, like, it was hard to think of at first, but it exists, doesn't it? It is a thing, I think.
It is a thing. Yeah, it's a thing. My last recommendation is going to be The Myth of Prometheus, because I think that there's a lot of similarities between the Prometheus story and or at least motifs, if nothing else, and the story of the hated pretender. Prometheus, of course, was imprisoned and tortured by birds and that kind of thing. And to some degree also the tale of Sisyphus, but it doesn't have the nice bird imagery.
I guess.
I think there were some clear inspirations going on in this dungeon. Like you said earlier, The Man in the Iron Mask is probably another one.
Oh, yeah.
And listeners, that's our show. Fear of a Black Dragon is a production of The Gauntlet. You can find The Gauntlet on Twitter at GauntletRPG. The Gauntlet has a website. It's gauntlet-rpg.com. And a Patreon. If you'd like to support this show, go to patreon.com/gauntlet and make a pledge there. Tom, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jason, and thanks also to our Epimethean editor, Rich Rogers. And thanks, listeners, for listening.
Take care. Hi listeners, I want to let you know about Codex Starlight 2, the newest issue of our indie role-playing game magazine, coming to the Gauntlet Patreon feed in early March. Codex Starlight 2 is one of the biggest and best issues yet, and it features Snipe Hunt, an original game inspired by movies like Red Dawn and Invasion of the Body Snatchers, in which a teenager takes a group of kids out into the woods for a snipe hunt in order to protect them from a calamity taking place in the town they live in. Bed, Breakfast, and Beyond, a one-shot hack of Brindlewood Bay about an elderly gay couple who run a bed and breakfast trying to figure out why guests keep disappearing from room 3. The Temple of the Peerless Star, a trophy gold incursion inspired by the dungeon made famous in the Discern Realities podcast and later published for Dungeon World in the original Codex Starlight. We've taken the core of that dungeon and expanded it for trophy gold, and it's great. 3 dozen more signs the stars are right, a miscellaneous sequel, 7 original illustrations, and a custom layout. You can get Codex Starlight 2 in the Gauntlet Patreon feed in March by making a $6 pledge. That's at patreon.com/Gauntlet. Thanks.